History as It Happens, July 11th, 2023. Otto and Miep.
What I'm asking you to do is dangerous. If you get caught, you could get arrested or... even worse, don't answer right away. You need to take your time to think it through. You need to talk it over with Jan.
No, I don't. What do I do?
The story of Anne Frank has captivated the world since her diary was first published in 1947. It's been translated into 70 languages with more than 30 million copies sold, and is often school kids' first exposure to the history of the Holocaust. Well, now, NatGeo, in a limited TV series, is telling the story of the Dutch woman who hid the Franks in Amsterdam. Her name was Miep Gies, and the show is A Small Light. We'll speak to people who knew her next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I'll just say one of the things that I learned, a lesson from Otto Frank, and that's sort of been mantra in very many ways. When I asked him if he knew who betrayed him, and he just said, it doesn't matter. I had to do that with this series because there were so many things that, that didn't happen. I don't know if that was, it was sort of like, but does it matter? Does it matter? I was so grateful that this story is being told, especially now when there's so much anti-Semitism and with such heart.
A voice within me is sobbing, you see, that's what's become of you. You're surrounded by negative opinions, dismayed looks, and mocking faces. People who dislike you, and all because you don't listen to the advice of your own better half. Believe me, I'd like to listen, but it doesn't work. Because if I'm quiet and serious, everyone thinks I'm putting on a new act and I have to save myself with a joke. And then I'm not even talking about my own family, who assume I must be ill, stuff me with aspirins and sedatives, feel my neck and forehead to see if I have a temperature, ask about my bowel movements and berate me for being in a bad mood, until I just can't keep it up anymore, because when everybody starts hovering over me, I get cross, then sad, and finally end up turning my heart inside out, the bad part on the outside and the good part on the inside, and keep trying to find a way to become what I'd like to be and what I could be if only there were no other people in the world. And these were the last words written by Anne Frank in her diary, Tuesday, August 1st, 1944, in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. 3 days later, the SS arrived at the address where Anne, her parents, Otto and Edith, and sister Margot had been hiding since 1942, along with 4 other Jews, 8 people in all hiding in that cramped annex. Otto Frank would be the only one to survive the Holocaust. Anne's diary and this story are known to millions of people around the world. A Pulitzer Prize-winning play appeared on Broadway in 1955. A Hollywood movie came out in 1959. Anne Frank was played by Millie Perkins.
Our stay here is over. They've given us just a moment to get our things. We can each take a bag and whatever it will hold of clothing. Nothing else.
And there have been many more movies since. It is a timeless story, one told to each new generation of school students who can relate to what it's like being a teenager with dreams and anxieties and fears. It is their entry point to the history of the Holocaust.
This diary. Will you please keep it safe for me? Because someday I hope that...
So last month, you might recall I did a couple of episodes about history on TV. I spoke to historian Ken Hughes about the White House Plumber series on HBO, and filmmaker Greg Barker about the series he directed for Showtime, Ghosts of Beirut, about the hunt for Ahmad Mugnia. You can check out those episodes if you missed them in early June, wherever you find this podcast, or at historyasithappens.com. So now, NatGeo has produced a series streaming on Hulu, A Small Light. It's about the Dutch woman and her husband who hid the Franks in the annex. Miep Gies is played by Belle Powley, and Otto Frank is played by a familiar face, Liev Schreiber. And our thanks to NatGeo for giving us the okay to play some clips from the series, which depicts the terror of living under Nazi occupation.
My application for a visa was turned down. It seems even my well-connected friend cannot pry open the door to America for my family. We have to get out. But there's nowhere to go.
I'm so sorry. I didn't realize it had gotten to this point.
No, I didn't want to bring my troubles to work. I wanted to keep you out of it, but it's not possible anymore. Miep, what I want to ask you, it's too much. I have no right, but I also have no option.
What is it?
We are going into hiding. Not right away. I still have a lot to plan.
Where?
It's better if you know as little as possible right now. But when we get there, I will need your help getting food and medicine.
Whatever you need.
Finish, please. What I'm asking you to do is dangerous. If you get caught, you could get arrested or even worse. Don't answer right away. You need to take your time to think it through. You need to talk it over with Jan.
No, I don't. I don't. What do I do?
And again, that was Belle Powley playing Miep Geese and Liev Schreiber playing Otto Frank. Their performances were excellent. Our guests in this episode knew the real-life Miep Geese and Otto Frank after the Second World War. Each found their way to Miep and Otto through different journeys, inspired by their strength and humanity, perseverance, and survival. They are Kara Wilson Granite, Father John Neiman, and Ryan Cooper. They met Otto and Miep in the 1970s, and they have opinions about A Small Light. But despite some inaccuracies, they found it emotionally powerful, as did I. And this is something I talked about in early June about those other TV series about history. There's always going to be some dramatic license. Movies are not history books, but they do connect with us in no less important ways. Kara Wilson Granite, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
And Father John Neiman, hello to you.
Hello.
And Ryan Cooper, hello.
Hi.
So let's just begin by having each of you briefly discuss how you got to know Otto and Miep, how you connected with them, because you all have different stories. Kara, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Martin. It's a pleasure to be speaking here, especially with my group, what I consider my brothers, Father John and Ryan. We love telling our stories, and we each have a different perspective. This whole journey began when I was 12 years old in Southern California. The Diary of Anne Frank was already a Broadway show, and people were very excited about it. This is the mid-50s. And talent scouts were everywhere trying to find the audition for Anne in the movie, the 20th Century Fox movie, The Diary of Anne Frank. And a talent scout found me. I looked a lot like Anne at 12 years old and asked if I wanted to audition for the part. Of course, I was thrilled because theater, dance, and all of that were in my blood, and I would love to do that. And that's the first time I read the diary, and I was absolutely devastated by it, moved by it. I had never read anything like that and never knew a girl my age who had gone through that and didn't survive. And it was a transformative time for me. So I do like speaking to middle school students because they're at that age where it impacts them so deeply. So of course, I went to 20th Century Fox and I auditioned, and of course I didn't get the part.
Millie Perkins got the part.
Millie Perkins got the part. Gorgeous Millie Perkins, model. And I'm this scrawny little 12-year-old, come on. No comparison, but...
I think I'm on a walk in the park where I used to go with Father, where the crocus and the jonquils and the violets grow along the slopes.
At the time, I said, I had heard that Otto Frank was probably the only survivor of the hiders. And they said, yes, he was still alive. And he was in Basel, Switzerland. And I said, could I please write to him? And they gave me his address. And that was the beginning of my journey writing to Otto Frank. You wanted to know how I also met Miep?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, our letters continued through the years, nearly 20 years, and I still had met Otto, and he basically became more of a grandfather, father figure. Really, I confided in him about everything. He was there for me in all twists and turns of my life. I adored him and really couldn't wait to see him, but I hadn't met him in person. Otto Frank's nephew, Buddy Elias, came and visited our family in Hollywood, where I lived at the time. And we had this wonderful conversation. He was quite an extraordinary person, and he looked a lot like Anne. He was an actor, very passionate, delightful human being, became a dear friend of our family. And he said, you first have to meet Miep before you see Otto and Fritzie. Fritzie was his second wife that he met coming back from the camps. I went to Amsterdam first, went to the Anne Frank house, where, of course, tourists everywhere. Miep met me with her husband, Jan, and took me through the house together.
Wow.
And was touring everything. So here I'm touring with Miep Gies. I could see how this feisty little lady could be, a no nonsense. She hooked me by the arm and said, now I will show you, and walked around, and she was pointing out here's where they slept, and here was Peter's room, and here is where I found the diary. People turned around and stopped and stared, and they said, who are you? She said, did you read the diary? I am Miep. And it was like being with a rock star.
Wow.
I mean, the place went crazy.
That's amazing.
So, yes, I mean, there are more stories about how my relationship with Miep, but that was my initial meeting.
She lived to 100. Otto Frank lived to 91 years
Right.
old.
That's right.
Father John, how did you wind up in Otto Frank's circle?
Well, I first read the diary when I was in 5th grade, and I was very moved and impressed with it, even though I didn't understand everything at that time. But I went out and got all kinds of books and about the Holocaust and anything I could find about Anne, and read more about it. And then in college, I wrote to Otto Frank. I decided I wanted to let him know how much the diary meant to me. But I wasn't doing it with the idea that I would go see him or meet him, but we ended up starting a correspondence. In one of his letters, he said, if you ever come to Switzerland, you should come and visit me. So I decided, oh my gosh, it would be wonderful to meet him. So I wrote to him and said, I'm coming, and gave him the dates. And I first met him and Fritzie in 1976 in their home in Beersfelden. And we became very close friends. We had a wonderful time together, and we became very close. And then in 1979, when I saw him the second time, which was in London, he said, well, how come, you go to Amsterdam? Why don't you go see Miep? And I said, well, I didn't even know that it would be okay to go see her. So he called Miep for me, and I met Miep and Jan in 1980. And we became very, very good friends. Every time I went to Amsterdam, she would give me a tour of the Anne Frank house, even though she had done it, several times for me. And she and Jan came to California when I was ordained a priest, and were at my ordination. And we just stayed in touch. I visited her quite often and saw her in the United States 2 other times. And Ryan and I had the honor of being at her 100th birthday party in 2009 in the Netherlands.
Wow. So Ryan, go ahead.
Similar to what Kara and Father John, this was in early 1970s. Just to give you a little background, I had been raised as a Jehovah's Witness. I had an incident where I had an engagement that was broken off with a fiance, and which really kind of devastated me. And at that point, I decided, I really didn't care much about going to witness meetings or everything like that, And so I found that some of my one-time brothers and sisters in the congregation decided to kind of almost abandon me. And in this period of total, really, isolation, I happened to catch the movie, The Diary of Anne Frank, one night, which led me to read The Diary of a Young Girl. And as I was fascinated by it, and I wanted to reach out and find out more information about Anne Frank, what happened to her and everything. So I read the Portrait and Courage by Ernest Schnabel, and who had gone around interviewing all these people that had known Anne, and especially Otto Frank. And I said, wow, that would be fab. I'd love to be able to do that. I wrote to the Anne Frank Foundation. I explained what I wanted to do. I says, I want to meet all these people. He says, I'm sorry, but a lot of these people have died and everything, but we can't give you Otto Frank's address. And so I wrote to him the first time in 1972. Didn't know whether I was going to get an answer or not, but the following month I got an answer, and he encouraged me to continue to write to him. And at that point, and this was in January 1973, and I says, I need to meet this man. And so I was living in Monterey. My mother had left me a tiny little shack of a house, which I sold. And with the money, I traveled across the country, drove across the country, stayed with my uncle for a while, and then flew off to Basel and met Otto in May 1973. And we really bonded immediately. It was through Otto Frank that I met Miep. And I went on to Amsterdam, and I spent the entire summer in Amsterdam, where I met Miep and was a frequent guest at her apartment over the summer, and we got to know each other quite well, though she was rather difficult to get to know because she had some difficulties with English, and you never knew what she was thinking. You never knew whether she actually liked you or not because she had very little expression in her face. It was almost like carved in stone. Mm-hmm. But gradually, you know, we got to know each other quite well, and she became quite close. And my subsequent visits, I always would stop and see Miep, and we spent quite a bit of time together. And of course, we corresponded over many, many of the years.
So, The Show, a small light streaming on Hulu, produced by NatGeo. My first issue with it was, and this is relatively minor, the language, right? I was hoping that it would be in Dutch or German right? Because they were in Amsterdam, and the Franks had moved to Amsterdam when the children were very, very young, so they all spoke Dutch. The parents spoke German. But pretty much the entire production is in English, and the actors have British accents, and their sensibilities are so British, I kept having to remind myself, this is Amsterdam, not London.
Mrs. Van Pels, a book on French cuisine?
Why all we have here is beans.
Oh, let me have my dreams.
Peter, this is for you. And, oh, Dr. Pfeff, I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I got you a Hesse novel.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Margot,
It's great.
I've heard this is a little bit racy, so I'll be borrowing it afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take a look at that.
Peter,
Oh,
give it
Kitty
back.
Foyle.
Oh, no, I'm going to read that first. You haven't finished your first book, Margot.
It really didn't bother me because I knew they were British actors, and it would have been nice if some of them have at least a little accent to give it a little more flavor of Europe.
I kept thinking they're going to ask for a spot of tea. I mean, not to make light, not to make light of it. But anyway, I don't know if Cara or Father John had an issue with that. But
No, I didn't. We have discussed together feelings about the show. I'll just say one of the things that I learned, a lesson from Otto Frank, and that's sort of the mantra in very many ways. When I asked him if he knew who betrayed him, and he just said, it doesn't matter. I had to do that with this series because there were so many things that, like, that didn't happen. I don't know if that was, it was sort of like, but does it matter? Does it matter? For me, the British accent or anything didn't matter. I was so grateful that this story is being told, especially now when there's so much anti-Semitism and with such heart. What mattered to me was that this story is being told.
Yeah. And we do know a lot about what actually did happen during those couple of years where they were hiding. Right. But there's going to be some dramatic license. And instead of just sticking to what actually happened, they may add in episodes where they're making something up to add to the dramatic effect. For instance, I'll just throw this out there. We know that twice they were nearly discovered, not by Nazis, but I think there was a repairman inside the building who came close to the annex, and then another time somebody else nearly accidentally discovered them. I don't think either of those situations is depicted in the show.
Well, there were burglaries also. There was many people. At one point, Otto said there was probably at least 250 people who knew that they were in hiding all around the whole neighborhood. People were in hiding. People knew there was somebody in that annex.
Oh, really?
Now, I love what Father John said, and I think this would be great for you to talk about. Otto Frank contributed, of course, to the details of the movie, The Diary of Anne Frank, and they didn't use any of his his suggestions.
You're talking about
Father
the
John, do you want-
1959 film now.
Exactly. But he was so happy that it was done. So Father John, I don't know. I love how you express that.
Well, I don't know if there's time for that story, but I know that Otto was very disappointed. He went to Hollywood. He has a great story. He said they wasted all their money in bringing him there because they didn't listen to anything that he said. And he was hoping to have the historical. He wasn't commenting on the technical or the acting or the costumes or any of those things.
Well, Father John, how do you think Otto Frank was depicted in this Hulu series by Liev Schreiber, a very well-established actor?
Yes, well, he an excellent actor. He didn't seem to me as being as warm as Otto is. And of course, they were living under those horrible conditions too. But I thought he did, overall, I thought he did very well. It's very difficult when you knew the person so well, you say, oh, well, he would never have said that, or he would, or whatever, and that would be for anybody, in any situation. I didn't like the fact that they portrayed him hesitating to bring in Dr. Pfeffer to the hiding place. That wasn't the way it played, and Miep had to kind of talk him into it. But that, I think, was in for dramatic effect.
And Ryan, how did you feel about the depiction of Otto and Miep as well?
Well, first of all, with Miep, I wouldn't have recognized her at all. Totally unlike the real Miep. It almost seemed like the actor that was playing Miep was acting more like Anne than Miep really was, because she was very, very careful about what she was saying, very carefully chose her words extremely, wouldn't really be a blabbermouth. And that's the kind of feeling that I got to the actor that played Miep. She was just running off at the mouth sometimes, and it just totally uncharacteristic of the real Miep. I agree with Father John about Otto. He did, the actor portrayed him pretty well. Yeah, he could have been a little more warmer. The thing that struck me is, I think in a couple of scenes, Otto kind of loses his temper. That was kind of almost uncharacteristic of Otto. I never saw him lose his temper ever, because he was extremely optimistic about everything. He always, that things would be better. They would be better. And of course, Anne picked up on that. And that's where she gathered her optimism from her father.
So, Kara, one thing the show does, which I think is effective, it depicts the moral choices everyone had to face. In the show, Miep takes the lead in hiding the Franks. What did she tell you about that choice as you got to know her after the war? That she faced, if she doesn't hide the Franks, they're doomed. If she does, she's putting herself and her family at risk.
Martin, I wish I'd had those conversations with her. I didn't. I think Father John and Ryan might have more in depth. Like Ryan described her, she wasn't a warm and fuzzy. When she looked at you, you could see where this woman, you don't mess with her. You don't fuss with her. That's where, when they did try to make her look really frivolous and la, 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 we didn't know her as a young girl, but I don't think she was ever like that. And certainly she wouldn't have been that frivolous. That wasn't who she was. She couldn't have done what she did. And she did not like to be called a hero. She said anybody would do that. I mean, the most in-depth conversation I had with her when we were in her apartment, and she said on August 4th, the day of their capture, that was the sober time for she and Jan. They would, close the curtains, light a candle, and pray. And she said it's a terrible, sad time. It was so close for her to be able to, near the war, the end of the war was almost over. She really fought for them. And the other time she said that she would not have read the diary. She realized those were Anne's writings. That was Anne. And she said when the other helpers wanted to read it, they said, no, this is Anne. This is Anne's work. She was private. She didn't want anybody to know what's in there. I'm saving it for Anne. So, I mean, those are the conversations I had with her, and the choices she didn't have to tell me. I could see it, that she was deeply, deeply loyal to Otto Frank and the family. She loved them and would have done anything for them, and did everything she could. You could see that the pain was there.
The series on Hulu ends with her, at least the final episode, questioning whether they did as much as they possibly could for the Franks and for others.
I think everybody would feel that way. I'm sure Otto felt that way. He desperately tried to have his family leave the country and and go and be free. He did everything he could. You saw the pain in his eyes. He, when he said to me, it doesn't matter, he had come to a peaceful place in his life when I met him. But you know that he wondered constantly, did I do the right thing? How could I have saved my children? You always do that. You second guess yourself. And I'm sure Miep felt those feelings.
Father John?
Yeah, Martin, Miep and I actually had a number of discussions about that because I was always telling her how much I admired her for everything that she did. And of course, again, she said, she goes, I am no hero. I am not hero. Don't call me hero. She said to me, and she said this in interviews also, she said, I imagined many sleepless nights if I had turned my back on my friends when they needed me. And she didn't hesitate when Otto asked her. That was correct portrayal. She didn't hesitate. She said, yes, I'm ready. I'm willing. Tell me what you want me to do. She had such a strong sense of right and wrong, being loyal, and especially to her friends, but even to people that she didn't know. You know, she risked her life every day. And then after they were arrested, she went back twice to Gestapo headquarters, putting herself in danger again, you know, to try to bribe the Gestapo to release.
So that is true that she tried to bribe those German officers to free the Franks.
Yes, that's true. What happened was one of the salespeople in the company, who actually was a Dutch Nazi, he came to Miep on that next day, that Saturday, and he said, you know, Miep, everybody loved Mr. Frank. Everybody loved him. So I bet if you go to all of the people, you know, they'll gladly give you money, and you go down. That sergeant, that Viennese sergeant, let you go. Maybe, you know, go and see if maybe, but you have to do it before they leave Amsterdam. So she did. She was able to gather quite a bit of money, but unfortunately, as she said, the curtain on that closed very quickly, that there was nothing more that she could do.
Ryan, did you find the way the show depicts that moral crucible? Did you find it convincing?
Well, as a dramatic miniseries, yes, it was very convincing. I recall that one of my experiences is where you could really see the character of Miep was on my first visit when I came to Amsterdam from Basel. And it was like she was reliving the war again. And I'll never forget how she was stood up in front of the window of their apartment, and she was looking up at the sky with a clenched fist and seeing the Allied bombers crossing over Amsterdam on their way to Germany. And I remember she just said with her clenched fist and fire in her eyes, she says, more bombs, more bombs. And she mentioned how so many people around her were totally afraid of the devastation that was going on around her. But you could just see the courage in her eyes and in her motions. And there was absolutely no question that she did whatever she could, not only to help to the Franks and the family in the annex, but other people. Even well after the war, she was doing so many things for other people in the neighborhood. And she would say to me, says, oh, I've got to go visit an old lady right now. You know, so she would be off to help somebody who needed her help, and that's the way she was.
The Nazis occupied the Netherlands for most of the war. They showed up in 1940, and they weren't driven out of there until very late. People had to get on with their day-to-day lives, and you see the range of emotions. There are even moments of happiness, celebration. People try to make the best of a bad situation. There are even moments where the Franks and the other families that are hiding with them are trying to make the best of it. What did you feel about the way they depicted life under Nazi occupation?
Well, that was the wrenching thing for me, because when you're watching this and say when you're reading the book, there's this great feeling of hope. We can get through this. You know, we don't have a lot to eat. We're arguing with each other or laughing with it. There's a family, a community in this tiny little bubble that you pray that they're going to get through this.
And the Allies are coming, right? They were listening to the BBC. They were listening to reports of the landings at Normandy. But go ahead, yeah.
Yes. Wonderful feeling of hope that you keep thinking, maybe they're going to make it. Maybe it's going to really happen. It really got to me. And what they captured in this, whether it was historically 100% or not, is that these are people that they were fighting for life. And Otto was like the glue to keep a normalcy, teaching the children, trying to keep them as normal as possible. When Anne and Peter would go up and they'd see the chestnut tree, and there was some patch of, levity and beauty, he would encourage that. I thought that was well done. It didn't bother me that some of it may not happen. What we got from it is that these were people that were doing everything they could to focus on life.
And a very claustrophobic situation.
Very, very much so.
Well, there is a scene near the end of the show where Edith Frank can't take being cooped up any longer, and she's not very optimistic at all. They're going to survive this. And she almost walks out of the building, the business. She leaves the annex. She comes downstairs where the business, Otto Frank's business, was, and she almost walks out into the street. Do we know if that happened? Anyone?
No, that did not happen.
Did not.
It's very true that she was very depressed, and she used to say, Miep, do you have some time? Can I talk to you? And she unburdened herself to Miep many times about how she felt that this was not going to end well. But none of them ever did anything like that. Sometimes in the evening when nobody was there, long after the workers had gone home, Ann and Margaret would go down and maybe do some filing that Miep and Bep had left out in the office, or they would go downstairs. But there was never a time when, right there in the work day when everyone was around, that any of them ever left the hiding place and came downstairs like.
I was struck by even the fact on the weekends they would leave the hiding place and walk around the main part of the building.
No.
I mean, that seemed risky. Anyone could walk in and...
That's where they had hot water for a bath. It was down in the kitchen in the office. So they would take turns going down and take a bath on the weekends when there was nobody there. But of course, curtains in any of the rooms that were in the curtains, everything was drawn. It wasn't like they were looking out onto the street or anything like that. And they were very careful. And as Kara said, Otto found out after the war that a lot of the people living around there knew. They didn't know who it was, but that they knew that there were people hiding that technically shouldn't have been there.
Wow.
But as you did in those days, which they didn't portray very well in the series, you kept secrets. Like the vegetable man, bringing them all those extra vegetables. He must have known.
Yes.
But he wouldn't have gone up to Miep and said, oh, Miep, how many people are you hiding? Because it was too dangerous for you, for the people in hiding, and for the other person. And the butcher, Mr. Von Pels was friends with. He had an arrangement with him before they went into hiding, and Miep would take the shopping list, and he would give her extra meat beyond what her ration coupons would take. And the man who supplied them with bread, Kleiman said, I need a lot of extra bread. And he would never have said to him, oh, is it because you're hiding people? No, I'm sure he must have realized that that's what he was doing. He gladly supplied him with that bread, and like everybody else, or at least the good people, they kept their mouths shut.
And Ryan, the Dutch resistance are depicted in the show as well. Jan Gies, Miep's husband, joins the resistance. You see him trying to get more ration cards, and then he's potentially involved in a plot to blow up a building, but he doesn't go at the last minute because Miep was concerned that he would get caught. And then, of course, that's it. Once the Gestapo have their hands on you, they kill you or torture you to death. Speaking of secrets, Ryan, there is a moment there where Miep forces her husband to fess up that he's in the resistance, and we know that people were very reluctant to share any of that kind of information because if they were ever caught by the Gestapo, they would be tortured to give up other people's names. Do you want to address those issues?
The activities that Jan was engaged in with the resistance, he kept definitely secret from Miep and obviously other people as well. And so I found it interesting because there was this very void in what actually Jan was doing. They used that void in the miniseries to add a lot of dramatic license. So of things that possibly he could have been involved with, probably not. But we just don't know. He would never talk about what he was actually doing to protect Miep and the others. Even after the war, he never talked about exactly what the activities that he was doing. Well after the war, when it would have been perfectly safe to talk about what he did, but he never did. He kept it very quiet, and even at the very end, after he died, Miep didn't know all the activities that Jan was involved in during the resistance.
During the war, did Miep know that he was even in the resistance, let alone what he may have been doing?
Oh, yes.
No, he did.
Well, I was just saying what Jan told Miep. He said, if I don't come home some night, don't worry. Someone within a day or two will contact you and let you know where I am and what has happened. They never, ever discussed any of the thing. Of course, he knew all about what Miep was doing because he was helping her. And Miep would never have questioned him like they portrayed, because she knew that it wasn't fair to him and it wasn't safe.
She followed him in one scene to a church where he was meeting resistance members. She was suspicious that her husband might be up to who knows what, and then that's when she drags it out of him afterward.
That didn't happen. That's all.
That did not happen.
Adds a little dramatic tension, I guess, to the show. But go ahead.
Well, there were two levels. Jan was a social worker for the city of Amsterdam. And there were colleagues in that department who were working, that was accurately portrayed, who were working to help people in hiding. So he had access to help people in hiding through that, but he also was part of the resistance. But what he did, we still don't know to this day, because as Ryan said, he never, ever discussed it, even with his family, his wife, his children, with Miep. He never, ever discussed specific activities that he participated in, as far as we know, with anybody, unless maybe if he got together with maybe some of his fellow colleagues later, he did, but I don't know about that. But I tried one time. I said, "Oh, Jan, tell me about the resistance. What you don't know? No, you don't. That you don't need to know about that. I don't talk about that."
And remember that when the Nazis were capturing the Franks and all the hiders, Miep was at her desk and Jan came in for lunch with something, and she said, "It is not good here." Do you remember that?
Oh, yes.
It's not good here, and that's when he tore up his identity cards, everything, and went out the door and went across the canal. That was a moment that they didn't have that, but that's basically, she's telling him, get out.
So that happened or it didn't happen?
No, it did happen.
Oh, that did happen. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, he shows up, he finds out the annex is being raided and he wants to help. But what could he do at that point?
Right.
So, Kara, how about the issue of Miep not being arrested after the Franks are hauled off? She is spared arrest in the show because the Nazi thug who is there is also from Vienna, just like she was. She was an immigrant to Amsterdam.
That is true.
Yeah. So that's true.
She recognized his accent. She just, she says, "Oh, you're from Vienna, so am I." That really saved her life. And he said, "Well, he was screaming at her, and he said, 'Well, you better not leave. I'm going to check on you and your husband, your man.'" And she says, "He knows nothing." And he says, "He knows everything." That was pretty dramatic, but it was very brave of her. And
a flicker of humanity there, a very, very small one. But she is trying to get through to him. The war's over. War's going to end. You don't have to do this. Leave the Franks alone. But
when she told me that story, she did it very animated. She says, "I recognized right away that he was from Vienna. And when he came in, I stood up and made myself as tall as I could. And I said, almost in a friendly voice, 'You're from Vienna. I'm from Vienna too.' And she said that he just stopped right in his tracks. And she said, here he must be thinking, here are two people from the same city. One wants to kill the Jews. One wants to save them." And then, of course, he did let her go. As Kara said, he screamed at her for a couple of minutes, but then he didn't arrest her.
Ryan, what did you think of the fact that there are no major, other than this one officer at the very end of the show, there are no major Nazi characters in this series, this limited series on Hulu? There's not a lot of information about how Nazi occupation policy worked. How did these people show up in Amsterdam and then find out where all the Jews were, who they were? Essentially, a bureaucracy is established. This is the evolution of the Holocaust, from making it basically illegal to be Jewish to then physical removal and extermination. You don't get a great sense of that from watching this show. What are your thoughts on that?
It was more focused on Miep and the drama around the hiding and everything, and not so much as a documentary about how the Nazis and the Germans were using various tools to capture the Jews. I don't even know if mentioned about the bounties that were placed on Jewish heads in a situation where there was just a lack of food and everything, and people needed money and things like that. How tempting it might be, to accept. And a lot, as Father John said and Kara said, a lot of people knew there were people hiding all over the city, and how tempting it might be to take advantage of a bounty, anonymously disclose where Jews were hiding. A lot of that, the people back then in Amsterdam, many of the Dutch were already anti-Semitic in some cases, and they would take advantage of it, and they would send people to their deaths for a few guilders.
They estimate that anywhere between about 25 to 28,000 Jews went into hiding during the war, and of that number, between about 10 and 12,000 were discovered, mostly through betrayal. And unfortunately, there were many people who were willing, either, through need, but also through greed, to betray and to turn in Jews. But there were also people like Miep, the many, of course, we don't even know their names anymore, of people who risked their lives, and many paid with their lives or paid with great suffering in prisons and concentration camps. Miep always said, I stand at the end of a very long, long line of good Dutch people. There were many good Dutch people, but there were also not so good Dutch people who did bad things.
So, as I often say on my podcast, the subject may be old, but the issues are fresh. So I want to talk to each of you about why this story still matters. Obviously, we have to educate every new generation about the Holocaust and history. But when you look back on what Miep Gies and her husband Jan did, there's a spectrum. We'll call it a spectrum of behavior. You can actively collaborate with people like the Nazis. You can actively resist. I think a lot of people just try to find some place in the middle there, keep their heads down, don't get involved either way, and wait for the fever to break and for the terror to pass. The Gieses chose resistance. They put their own lives on the line, which is very hard to do. But their story is a timeless one because we live at a time of mass migration, of desperate people seeking help. And in different parts of the world, there are terrible racial or ethnic persecutions taking place.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Martin, because to me, I don't deify Anne or deify Otto. These are not saints, they're human beings, and Miep. But these are people that made choices, positive choices, in the midst of horror. I would call myself a hope junkie. This story to me, the story of hope in spite of the terror of this tragic ending, because you get to see what people do and fight to do to keep a story, a message of love over hate alive. And then the turning point in the 60s, when one of my favorite moments with Otto was when I gave up and I just didn't want to go on because of the assassinations of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King and, the Vietnam War, all of this, and Bobby Kennedy. I said, I'll never bring a child into a world this cruel. And Otto wrote back to me and said, you cannot give up hope. Even if the end of the world would be imminent, you still plant a tree today. And to me, that's who Otto was. My book is The Tree of Hope. He believed in hope. That's what Miep was. She wouldn't have done everything. Every choice she made was to feed these people, to keep them alive, to fight for their life. Otto did that. Anne, in her way, keeping, her words alive. It's a story of hope. So yes, there are Annes all over the world. There are Mieps all over the world. There are Ottos. These are people that made choices of positivity that we need to learn from.
Where did Otto Frank get his strength from after losing everything? He lost his wife, he lost his 2 daughters in the Holocaust.
I would say, and I would be interested in what Father John and Ryan say, I would say initially when he found out that his daughters were killed in Bergen-Belsen, when they died of typhus, and he was holding on to seeing them more than anything, when he realized that was it, all of them had died, especially his children, he had given up. But when Miep and Bep brought the diary and all her work, all her writing, and put it in front of him, and Miep said, this is your daughter's legacy. And he started reading her words. He was devastated. He was, of course, like he was in shock. But he knew one of the things she said is, I want to go on living even after my death. And even though he was a very private man, he would not have had this published, but when he started showing her words to his family, his mother, his sister, people around, they said, you have to publish this. This is a voice of young people all over the world. You have to keep this going. My belief is that in publishing this and talking about it, he was able to keep his daughter alive, and her life gave him life. And then when all the children started writing to him from all over the world for strength, his parenting continued. And he was able to continue being the parent he always wanted to be. He gave lectures, he talked about her and hope all the time.
Generations of young people have read that diary because of what you just explained. 70 languages it's been translated into, 30 million copies sold. Father John?
First of all, the series that we're talking about, A Small Light, is based on something that Miep always said, that she said, even the most ordinary person, a secretary, a housewife, a teenager, can light a small lamp or a small light in a dark room. And she was very adamant about that. You can be an ordinary person, but do extraordinary things. Mm-hmm. And that was very important to her. What Kara said is exactly right. I think the diary gave Otto a whole new purpose for living, because when it was published and as he started to get letters, he found all of this. He found a whole new family that he could be, as he told Sal de Lima in Auschwitz, his good friend. He said, I want you to call me Papa Frank, because that will help me survive. I need to be a papa to somebody. And that was very important to him. And he found this whole new family of thousands and thousands of people all over the world, from every culture, every faith, every ethnic group, every country, that became, we say, Otto's children, or, his family. And he really, really, truly believed that the message of Anne's diary, the hope expressed in the diary, could make a difference in the world as far as bringing peace, fostering good relations between people, breaking down walls, forming friendships, everything that's good and positive and wonderful about life. Otto saw that in the diary and felt that he had that mission now in his life to be that ambassador, since Anne, of course, didn't come back, but the diary was still.
Ryan, why is this, in your view, why is this story still so important to tell?
It's still very important to continue on, to carry on the legacy of not only Anne and Otto Frank, but for the millions of Jews and others that were lost during the Holocaust. And I wanted to mention that Otto told me one time, when I didn't know really what I wanted to do, and he said, I would encourage you to follow Anne's own wish to work for mankind. And at the time, it didn't really sink into me at that time. But what happened was, after Otto had passed away and I had no more Otto anymore, I stopped actually writing back to Fritzie for a while. But then I had a cabinet maker, a carpenter here in my house, and we were putting in a new library in the house. And he saw these books about Anne Frank and Otto Frank, and he asked me what all this interest was. And when I told him that I had known Anne Frank's father, and then he asked me if I would talk to his wife, who was a teacher, a middle school teacher. And I said yes. And through her, I had the invitation to speak for the very first time to a class about my relationship with Otto Frank, but also about the Holocaust. After I did that talk, there was a young girl, 14 years old, who came up to me, and she said, "Can I write to you?" And she wrote to me, and she said that she felt guilty that she was German. And so I wrote back to her that Otto didn't feel any animosity to the German people for the Nazis and what they did. So in a sense, I felt that first talk that I gave and the subsequent talks that I'd done over the years since that one time, that was over 20 years ago, that in a sense, I was following that wish to work for mankind by carrying on Anne's legacy and Otto's legacy to teach the young people about the Holocaust so that it keeps carrying on, so that it will never be forgotten.
And I believe we always have choices. I remember, I have got to find out who said it, but somebody was asking whether it was Viktor Frankl or someone, maybe you know, that who are these monstrous people who did these monstrous things? And one of them said, oh, they weren't monsters. They were you and me who made monstrous choices. That really affected me, because we are human beings capable of really anything. And we can make positive choices, and do most of the time. But when there's that other side, a darker side, that I think we're here to make positive choices, to choose love over hate. Those are constant choices all the time.
Richard Evans, the great historian, wrote in the final paragraph of his 3-volume series on the history of the Third Reich, the Third Reich raises in its most acute form the possibilities and consequences of the human hatred and destructiveness that exists, even if only in a small way, within all of us.
Yes.
It demonstrates with terrible clarity the ultimate potential consequences of racism, militarism, and authoritarianism, and it shows what can happen if some people are treated as less human than others. On the next episode of History as It Happens, why is Connecticut exonerating women who were convicted as witches and executed like 300 years ago? We're going to get into that with Kate Carté and the witch craze next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.